The Blue Collar Economist podcast. No, the Blue Collar Breakdown. I'm gonna change that intro one of these days. I have a new outro every week, but I don't have a new intro. I'm gonna have to fix that. I'm Tom Edlam, the Blue Collar Economist. I got a good show for you today. And before I start, I want to tell you this. I have a very important article coming up over at the Libertarian Institute. I don't know if they'll publish it this week or next week, but it's one of the most important things that I've written, maybe ever, but certainly in a long time. The essence of it is I go into detail using numbers, explaining why the economy is rigged against you, the working man, whether you're a poor working man, middle class, or you're fairly well off and you're a wealthy doctor or attorney. It's rigged against you and in favor of the billionaire investor class. So I guarantee you, if you read this article, you will never look at your government the same. Okay, so I strongly encourage you to read that article when it comes out. And of course, until then, keep checking the Libertarian Institute website because they've got lots of other great stuff every single day. And you definitely want to check that out. And of course, there's lots of other great podcasts also over at the Libertarian Institute. In fact, I'll get mine listed there in pretty short order. I wanted to get my podcast off and running and have some sort of a track record before I started saying, hey, listen, my podcast on the first week that I started. So, but this is episode 7. So 7 weeks in a row, I've done it. So that's some level of consistency. Okay. Before I get into my topic today, let's do a little story hour. And by story hour, I mean like story 5 minutes. There once was a very independent and wealthy country. And all the people in it were very fiercely independent and responsible for themselves. And they were very proud of their individual wealth and their rugged individualism. But there came a point where they realized, gee, some of the elderly, some because of bad fortune, some because they were irresponsible, a variety of different reasons, but some of the elderly had a tough time making ends meet without extra help when they retired. When they hit 65 or 70, whatever it was, they had a tough time. Now, they all got along. These elderly people had churches and there were mutual aid societies and there were all kinds of aid for them. But, the society felt like, the elderly should be taken care of and they shouldn't have to rely on charity or family, which some of them didn't have family. So they set up a government program and it was very expensive and it got more expensive over time. But you know what? The people were so rich and so independent that they continued to prosper more than ever. And then what happened was after a little while, they realized, well, some of the down and out didn't really have what we would today call food security. It's not that they were starving to death, but they didn't have money for food. And they had to go to, churches and again, to those mutual aid societies. So the society got together and said, look, we can help these poor people. We can just add an extra tax and we'll take care of them. And we'll have a program for the hungry. But they still continued to prosper. They were still rich. And they still had all of this untold wealth. But after a little while, they realized, well, some people can't afford to advance because they're kind of stuck on the margins. Most people were still super rich compared to all of the neighboring societies, but they can't afford to go on to higher education or college. Maybe we should have the government create a program, have everybody pool their money because we want to be a meritocracy. We want all the people who can contribute to our society to do so. And in fact, one of the things we know is that people who go to college tend to produce more. They tend to maximize their potential. And that's what we want as a society. So they levied another tax, and they allowed a lot of people who weren't able to go to college before to go to college. And the society still proved to be pretty wealthy and still pretty prosperous. And then they realized, okay, but healthcare costs are tough. I mean, especially, when you've got all of this innovation, all these, there's all kinds of new medical procedures that cost money, that cost labor, that, and a lot of people are unable to afford it. So what if we just levied a tax just to help the people on the margins? We'll help people just get enough so that they can go to the doctor and not worry about going bankrupt or having not to forego a medical operation. And what happened was a lot of the old church hospitals that were charity hospitals, they kind of a lot of them went out of business or were sold to corporate partnerships that were contracted with the government, but the society was still fairly wealthy. And then a couple years went by, and then they realized, gee, a lot of our young people can't afford to buy a house. What are we going to do? Well, we should create some programs to help them buy a house. And someone came along in this society and said, we've added all these extra taxes. We've added a tax to promote income security for the elderly and for the food and for the education and the healthcare, and now for housing and for so many other needs. What if we just got rid of all the taxes and we went back to being the prosperous society we once were? And almost universally, that person was condemned because they were said, the people who were by this time just barely getting by said, there's no way we could afford it. No one could afford it. No one could afford to go back to that way because people aren't generous. They wouldn't give to a church or mutual aid society. These people would starve in the streets. They would, even though they never had in the past. This rugged, individualistic, self-reliant society had become dependent upon government, and they had forgotten how they got prosperous, and they'd forgotten, and with all of the taxes that were hidden, they didn't realize how much they were paying into all of these programs, these government programs that had continued to increase in cost with very little benefit. That's America today. All right. And what I want to talk to you today is kind of indirectly related to that. I want to talk about democracy in the modern sense of the term, not the pure Athenian democracy, but where the people vote and they get their way, through representatives, or at least the politicians say they get their way. And I'm going to pretty much take Hans Hermann Hoppe's side here. Democracy is the god that failed. That was his quote in one of his books, which I have not read, but I already agree with it. I think there's a fundamental problem in American society with our system of government. It goes down to the core. It's corrupted from top to bottom, but the systemic problem is not that bad. I mean, I'm almost tempted to agree with both Hoppe and with Winston Churchill, who said, I think it was Winston Churchill who said, democracy is the worst form of government except all the others. Because when we talk about government, it's compared to what? We could compare it to anarchy, which has never existed, despite the fact that many anarcho-capitalists think that Murray Rothbard was right, that medieval Ireland had no government, which it did. It did have a government. I'm not going to discuss anarchism. What I want to discuss is the failure of classical liberalism. And I've always considered myself a classical liberal. I would like to see classical liberalism moving toward anarchy. And if we get there, great. If we could actually do the last abolition of the last kind of government, that's great. But I don't, obviously, anarchy is not a practical thing right now. And a lot of people don't even realize that even classical liberalism is a practical thing. They think that what they cannot afford to go back to classical liberalism because they're convinced that the $200 a month that they get in SNAP benefits or the $5,000 that their kids get in Pell Grants are a net benefit from government. And they're not. I'll get into that a little bit later. So where does this all start? Well, let's go back to the founding. Let's go back to the Constitution and James Madison. James Madison, I think, was the greatest political thinker in all of human history. I think he really nailed it. I think his very best work was Federalist Number 10. Federalist Number 10 talked about the role of faction and how the best kind of government, if you wanted to stop a totalitarian government, you had to check faction against faction, or by faction, he meant like an interest group. And the interest group could be a majority or a minority, but you had to have these different groups who wanted, in many instances, opposite things, check their interests. You know, think about it from the perspective of the 1780s and 90s, where you had farmers versus manufacturers. You had men versus women. You had different religions, Protestants and Catholics, and you had all of these different factions. And the idea behind it was to make sure that there was this sort of they would fight each other, but not physically. And it would come to this sort of neutral ground. The factions would check each other, and it would keep government to a minimum and allow people to live peacefully together. And for a good while, despite all of the excesses that really in the federal government, they really started almost immediately. The U.S. Constitution didn't authorize a national bank, and one of the first things that the federal government did was create a national bank. The U.S. Constitution didn't allow for the suppression of free speech. In fact, it prohibited it with the First Amendment, but they passed the Sedition Act. The U.S. Constitution didn't allow for any controls over immigration, though that was handled by the states. And immediately they passed the Alien Acts, which allowed the federal government to deport terrorists or suspected terrorists, which was a state responsibility. That was why the Virginia and Kentucky resolutions were enacted against it. So the excesses came immediately. But for the most part, we had this fairly limited government. The U.S. government spent less than 2% of the GDP in the United States. Not today, it's more than 20. And you add in the state and local governments, and it's pretty hefty. So what went wrong? I mean, factions. I mean, here's the interesting thing. A lot of people are going to say I've gone off the deep end, that I'm for disenfranchising a lot of people, taking away people's votes, and I am, and I'm going to get to that. But let's just talk for a second about James Madison. Like, he was concerned more about individual rights than majority rule, because let's face it, in a majority rule, if you have majority whites and they want black slaves and the minority is blacks, well, they're going to be slaves under pure democracy. The idea was we want individual rights, and this is the best method here. This not democracy, but this republic. I mean, Madison was very clear in the Federalist Papers, and he even says, I'm going to read here from Federalist 10. He says, let's see, democracies. Democracies have ever been spectacles of turbulence and contention, have ever been found incompatible with personal security or the rights of property, and have in general been short in their lives as they have been violent in their deaths. Now, in this case, he was talking about pure democracy, majority rule. And basically what the history of it is, Athens didn't really last that long. They were very violent. All the Greek city states, they were very violent, and they were, of course, subsumed initially by Macedonia and then later by other. It just didn't work. Republics have worked for many centuries, but not especially perfectly. But our country, it worked fairly well, at least until the 1930s, and arguably much later than that. But in the 1930s, there was this new movement globally that we kind of collectively we call fascism. It started with Italy. I mean, and Mussolini was the one who coined the term. And a fascist is simply a bundle of sticks tied together with an axe handle at the end. And the fascist, the idea is it's hard to break the bundle when they're bundled together. You can break the individual sticks, this sort of thing. So Mussolini's idea was, and he didn't say this explicitly, but well, he did say this explicitly. He wanted to bring all of the interests of society into the government. So he wanted to bring industry into the government. He wanted to bring labor unions into the government. He wanted to bring religious associations, even churches, into the government. He didn't really bring the Catholic Church formally into the government in Italy, but he wanted to bring the different groups into the government. Whereas in the United States, of course, that wasn't the idea. The idea was to keep them separate and keep them out of the government. The government would be influenced by these institutions, but would not influence these institutions. It was sort of the one-way influence is churches and unions and industry would influence government, but government wouldn't influence them the other way. That was the idea. And in fascism, it was a two-way street, that the unions and corporations and private institutions would all come into the government formally. They would be influenced by the government, and the government would have a level of control. And this was also copied to a certain extent in Nazi Germany. And in Italy, the policy, unstated, although a lot of people say this was a Mussolini quote, or Mazzini, one of his economists, has said, fascism is the union of corporations and the state. He never said it, but that was absolutely part of the policy. And it wasn't just the corporations. If you use the term broadly, corporations, that's true, because a lot of times in the past, people talk about unions were corporations, churches were corporations. They were all organizations, and that's what he meant. He brought them all in, and he had this Grand Council of Fascism that was part of the government. So that also happened in the United States, that a lot of these institutions, and it was fairly formal under Franklin Delano Roosevelt in the 1930s. A lot of it got struck down by the Supreme Court, but the initial National Recovery Administration, the NRA, not the gun group, the goal was to bring all of the industry together into the government, and they would work together. Didn't work out because the Supreme Court said it was unconstitutional, and I can get into the reasons for it, but I'm not going to right now. So Flynn wrote this great book in 1944. So this is at the height of, it was published in 44. So he wrote it at the height of World War II, where we're fighting fascism. And he basically went over 4 kinds of fascism. He went over what he called the soil of fascism, which is the where it grew out of, which is Italy. And then he talked about the bad fascism, which was Germany. And then he also talked about the fascism of Franco's Spain, and then finally the United States under the New Deal. And it's interesting. In the book, this is 1944. Okay, here's what he says, and it's sort of like that Sinclair Lewis quote that became popular. I don't know, it was probably said about the same time, but here's John T. Flynn in this book, As We Go Marching, which, by the way, you can get for free digitally on Mises.org. Okay. When fascism comes to America, it will not be in the form of an anti-American movement or a pro-Hitler Bund practicing disloyalty, nor will it come in the form of a crusade against war. It's not going to be anti-war, okay? Nor will it come in the form, or it will appear rather in the luminous robes of flaming patriotism. It will take some genuinely disingenuous or genuinely ingenuous shape and color, and it will spread only because its leaders, who are not yet visible, will know how to locate the great springs of public opinion and desires and streams of thought that flow from them, and will know how to attract to their banners leaders who can command the support of the controlling minorities in American public life. The danger lies not so much in the would-be Führers who may arise, but in the presence in our midst of certain deeply running currents of hope and appetite and opinion. The war upon fascism must begin there. And this is the real crux of it. This is where I find we need to go in America eventually. What I'm going to propose is hugely unpopular. Could not possibly happen under any conceivable political deal on as we are presently constituted. But these streams of thought, these dedicated political minorities, because most groups are minorities, not majorities. This is where the corruption is. This is the failure of Madisonian democracy. And by that, I mean specifically the corrupting power of government in the form of spending. And I would contrast this with campaign finance reform. It's been a huge issue for the last, 40 years. I mean, even back to the actually more than that. I mean, it went back to the 70s. It was huge campaign finance reform laws in the 1970s. But in the 1990s, we had McCain-Feingold, which was declared unconstitutional. And the goal of campaign finance is to control the money going into politicians and elections. And if you look at the amount of money going into campaigns, I mean, in 2024, there was about $23 billion spent on campaigns, including all the advertising and the staff and everything. Okay, $23 billion. This is a big business. And that's several $1,000. No, it's maybe $800 per person in America. So it's big business. I mean, we have 331 million in America. So yeah, it's a lot of money. But I don't think that's the corrupting influence. I mean, can a politician be bribed with campaign contributions? Yeah, it can be. But that's not the fundamental problem in our system. And if you look back before the 1930s, there were people giving campaign contributions, and the level of corruption was a lot less. And why is that? Because $23 billion is not that much money when you come right down to it. It's not enough to buy off every politician. It's not the problem. And a lot of people also like to talk about how the media has this influence. I mean, well, just think of it from the perspective of the big five companies. All right, the big five, the companies that control most of the television: ABC Disney, NBC Universal, CBS Viacom, Time Warner Turner CNN, Fox News Corp. All right, those 5 companies spend $200 billion every year, 10 times as much as there is campaign finance. All right, now a lot of that's theme parks and the rest, cruise ships, whatever, with Disney. But the point is, the media far outspends the campaign finance ads. The campaign finance ads hardly make a dent, comparatively speaking, to the big media. But even that is just dwarfed by the amount of money government spends to bribe its own citizens. How much do you think the federal government spend? And not just the federal government, state and local governments too, because the government, though, they also spend money. How much do you think they spent in 2024, the same year that $23 billion was spent on campaign elections? Well, it was 10,700 billion, $10.7 trillion. So hundreds of times more. And that, I think, is the main corruption in our society. The government spends, if you look at campaign spending, it's several hundred per person. If you look at the big 5 media companies, it's several thousand per person. But government spends $32,000 for every person, or $66,000 for every household. It's more in Massachusetts, where I live. It's closer to 75,000. And one of the things that people think is, gee, I'm never going to be able to afford life if government cuts my $200 SNAP benefit, or my kid can't go to college if I don't get that $5,000 Pell Grant, or gee, if I can't get an affordable housing deal with my local state government, I'm never going to be able to buy a house. If I don't get a HUD loan guaranteed, or whatever it is, there's always some little. They take tens of thousands from us and give us 1,000 back once in a while, and then say, "See what a good deal you're getting from government." And we don't realize how much we actually pay to the federal government in the form of, and compare it to what we get back. It's very little. Government is not even a straight transfer, because it's a very leaky transmission belt. There's tons of waste. So even if they were perfect in taking our money and giving it back to us, we'd still be only even. Yet there's tons of waste. So what we have here is voters who are dedicated to keeping their government benefits. And it's not just poor people. I've used SNAP benefits and Pell Grants, which is more for poor and middle class. But a lot of times it's for people who work for fairly wealthy corporations, the corporations who say, look, we get our money from the government, and you have to back this program. If you work for Boeing, you've heard about the Export-Import Bank and how the Boeing relies upon the loan guarantees in order to sell its jets abroad. If you work for Tesla, they rely on government subsidies. If you work for SpaceX, they're all government subsidies. If you work for Lockheed Martin, they depend upon the military-industrial complex and their spending. There are all of these influences, if Madison would call them factions, who are promoting more government spending. And I think the solution is we've got to disenfranchise the state. And by disenfranchise, I mean take their vote away. If you take a check from the government, this would solve it. If you take a check from the government, or if you work for a company that takes a check from the government, you don't vote in the next election. You want your vote? You work for a company that's purely private. And I think that writes all the interest, because the interest right now is all of the defense contractors They maximize the number of districts, congressional districts that they have their factories in order to maximize their appropriations in legislation and their contracts with government officials. And that is going to continue as long as the votes continue to be beholden to it. I mean, I've known a lot of people who say, look, I believe in less government, but I'm going to vote my pocketbook. And my pocketbook is, I need this government subsidy. And then, of course, in the long run, you don't need the subsidy. It might, if we were to do a Javier Milei and just cut it all out, he probably could cut more. But if we were to do that, most people would be very inconvenienced for 6 months to a year. But then they would say, oh, I didn't realize I had this much money. Unless you're actually directly working for the government, then you would have to find a real job. But for the most part, I think the solution is the failure of Madison was to realize that voters are influenced by who pays them. And in his time, very few people worked for the government, so it was a very small influence. But gradually, over time, and especially since the New Deal, that became a larger and larger influence. Both those who are working directly for the government and those who are contractors for the government or who are getting a government benefit. And that's why democracy has failed. That's why fascism has succeeded. The interests are now in the government. The people are now working hand in glove with the government. It's my 2 cents. All right. Let's see. I've got a couple of, I do have a comment here. Yay. Let's show it. Hey, great to see you. Oh, I'm glad to have I'm glad to be able to actually post a comment. I've had these shows for what, almost 2 months now, and I haven't been able to post a comment, but hey, it's great to see Sentinels of Liberty. I've been on, by the way, if you haven't viewed Sentinels of Liberty, you really need to. It is a great show. And one of the proofs of it is I've been on it several times, but also Scott Horton was on it last week. So and another frequent guest is my friend Sean Kennedy, who is the chairman of the American Liberty Caucus, also chairman of the Massachusetts Libertarian Party. So there's always a good, well, not always a good guest, because my friend Jeremy, the Redbeard, he doesn't always have a guest, but he often has guests, and they're always good. So I definitely suggest that you check out Sentinels of Liberty. All right. Yep. Don't want to do, I don't know what that is, but spam comments. All right. I think that's about all I got for today. Again, check out my article on the Libertarian Institute. It's not out yet. Like I said, might come out this week, might come out next week, but you will not look at your government the same after you realize how badly the economy is rigged on behalf of the billionaires. And maybe I should have, in this talked more about how the billionaires and their interests are represented in government, and how they've been able to use a lot of these subsidies to promote themselves and get voters to vote for these subsidies. Subject for a future video. All right. Thank you for watching. Make sure you like, subscribe, comment, share, do all that stuff. And here is my outro, my Suno outro.